First and foremost, I want to thank you so much for coming on the platform. I really appreciate you. This is definitely an honor, and I look forward to hearing more about the amazing work that you have been doing and the amazing work that you have coming in the future.
Right on.
All right, all right. Now, for the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are, where you're from, and what do you do?
Gerald Horne, historian and author, presently cited in Texas.
All right, all right. Now, I want to ask you this. Now, when did you develop this passion for writing and history? Was this something that you got into early on in life, or did you kind of develop a passion for it later on?
Well, I think it's both. I think from growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, my working class parents, as has been the case for many working class parents, oftentimes use the public library as a kind of daycare. And myself and my sisters were dropped off in the public library early on, where we entertained ourselves by reading books, or at least thumbing through books in some cases. And I think that helped to set me off on my present course, as well as the fact that even though I adamantly discourage it today, I was a child laborer growing up in St. Louis, Missouri. I sold newspapers on the streets. You don't necessarily see that nowadays, even in poor and working class neighborhoods. And from selling newspapers, I inevitably began to read newspapers, a habit that I maintain to this very day, although admittedly, at the age of 7 or 8, I was mostly reading sports pages and comic strips.
Oh, wow. Okay, okay. Now, I could say this. I know a lot of people, and even children and parents too, they take the library for granted. They take history for granted. But, once you learn history, it can be very empowering. And the library is just such an amazing place. Even now, they got music studios where you can record music, you can record video, you got computers. So, I know back in your day, they didn't have all that, but it's just, amazing to see how, libraries have developed and they're such an amazing place.
Oh, I agree. They are an underutilized resource, and that's one of the many reasons why they're under attack today by the right wing in terms of banning books and all the rest.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, man, definitely. Okay, now I can ask you about this. I wanted to ask you about one of your books, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. What is that about, and what inspired you to write about that topic in particular?
So it deals with the origins of what is referred to as settler colonialism in North America that led to the creation of the United States of America post 1776, with the revolt against the British Empire led by slave owners, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the other settlers who you now find on your currency. That is to say that the book you just referenced deals with the invasion of those from the British Isles into what they call Virginia in the early 1600s, and what ensued, including wars against the indigenous, mass enslavement of the Africans. That book is preceded chronologically by a book called The Dawning of the Apocalypse, which deals with the 16th century. It deals with the 1500s, in other words. And it sets the stage for the apocalypse of settler colonialism, insofar as it talks about what happens post 1492 with Columbus sailing the ocean blue, encountering the Americas, encountering actually islands off the coast of what we now call Florida, and what ensued with regard to the Spanish Empire, but how this minor monarchy on the fringes of Western Europe, speaking of what we now refer to as Great Britain, was swept up in the secession from the Roman Catholic Church led by Martin Luther in 1517, leading to the creation of what we call Protestantism, and how that inaugurated a round robin of religious wars between Protestants and Catholics, principally Protestant London and Catholic Madrid, for example. And as I tell the story, just to fast forward a bit, what happens is that the Spanish, in terms of establishing their empire in the Americas, a privileged religion. You could be of African descent in Cuba in the 1500s and still be a conquistador. However, the scrappy underdogs that were the Protestants, they had a deficit in terms of numbers to confront the Spanish. And so improvisationally, they moved to reconcile with those they had been warring with on the shores of the British Isles, speaking of the Irish, the Welsh, the Scots, etc. And as they crossed the Atlantic in a maneuver that would make Madison Avenue blush, they morph into a new politics of identity, speaking of whiteness, then leading to white supremacy, then leading to those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Welsh, English versus Scots, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Serb versus Croat, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian. The list is veritably endless. They too are inducted into this new politics of identity known as whiteness, morphing into white supremacy. And that is the backstory for the creation of settler colonialism in North America beginning in the 1600s.
Wow. Okay. That's really amazing. Now I can ask you this. It's two questions. How long does it take to research and write a project like that? And is there an abundance of information and documentation, in relationship to the project that you were writing?
Oh, yeah, there's definitely an abundance of information. I would just point you to the Huntington Library outside of Pasadena, California, which is a treasure trove of historical documents. As a matter of fact, I would suggest visiting the Huntington, even if you're not a historian, because it also includes an art museum and a wonderful botanical garden, not to mention scrumptious meals that are not that expensive. There are numerous archives. I use the National Archives of the UK in London, the British Library in London. There's an abundance of information. How long does it take to write such a book? Well, the two books I just mentioned are fundamentally summaries. When you dig in to do primary research, that is to say, books that are not summaries, but you're creating an original historical account, it takes longer. It may take, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 years, not working every day, but working intermittently. Whereas doing these summaries, like the book on the 16th century and the book on the 17th century, that may only take a couple of years working, not every day, working intermittently.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you taking out the time to, put forth these projects because I don't know if you're familiar, if you are on social media a lot, but it's a lot of, I guess, Black Americans today, or I won't say a lot, but there are a significant number that may either deny the slave trade or downplay the severity of it. And like you mentioned, there are archives and museums and slave ports all over the world. But, unfortunately, a lot of our people, we struggle to learn our own history, let alone the history outside of America.
Well, I'm familiar with that tendency you just mentioned. My own opinion is that in order to overcome the formidable barriers that we face today, including white supremacy, labor exploitation, police terror, and all the rest, that you need a firm grasp of how we arrived at this point. And fairy tales will not necessarily be helpful in terms of gaining that firm grasp that'll lead us out of the present abyss. That is my own analysis.
Yeah, you're definitely right. You're definitely right. And for me, I could say myself is it's been very empowering. I don't know if I told you I'm in Africa right now. I'm in Madagascar. I'm on the east side, but I've had the chance to study abroad in the Caribbean, study abroad in South America, live in Africa. So, going through the process of learning because things kind of played out differently in each place. We went through the same thing, but for me overall it has been empowering. It has gotten me closer to that destination, like you said, getting that firm grip and understanding of what we've been through and what we continue to go through today.
Might I ask, so what are you doing in Madagascar?
Well, my ultimate goal is to live in Africa permanently. So I've been to about 20 African countries. I'm just looking for a place to live. So I'm enjoying Madagascar. It's really nice. It's a beautiful place, culture, people. And Africa is so diverse. You would think like, oh, you seen one African country, you've seen them all, but it's really a nice place. Have you been to Africa?
I lived in Zimbabwe and I visited numerous African countries. And of course, I've written books about Zimbabwe, Southern Africa, including Namibia, where I did a fair amount of research. I've written about Ghana. I should also say that in my book, The Apocalypse of the Settler Colonialism, there are a few notes about Madagascar, because at the end of the 1600s, you had Yankees from New York who were enslavers, who were enslaving folk from Madagascar. And in fact, I do interviews, at least I have been doing interviews for KPFK, a radio station in Los Angeles. They can all be found on the Activist News Network on YouTube. And I interviewed a scholar about Madagascar, and we talked about the slave trade from Madagascar to North America, indicating that a percentage of Black Americans actually have roots in that large island off the southeast coast of Africa.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting because, okay, so we always learn about the slave trade from like a West African perspective. And some people will even say we just from the West side. But I myself, I always look at Africa as being a part of it. The East side, to my understanding, they had just as many slaves traded or more. But I would say for the first time, I was in Madagascar. I seen like one, two, three. I seen like about three ladies that reminded me of my mom. They look like my mom. Like usually when I'm traveling through Africa, I see somebody that look like my dad or look like a cousin or a friend. But it was like the first time where I got to see a few women that favored my mom and my aunts. And I took a DNA test, and I did have like a percentage of some East African DNA, and Madagascar was one of the countries that was listed on there.
Well, sure. I mean, there was also a slave trade to the United States from Zanzibar. In fact, that island also off the southeast coast of Africa, part of Tanzania. In the 1840s, the economy was dominated by U.S. nationals. Slave trade from Mozambique on the southeast coast of Africa. There were close connections between the settlers in Cape Town at the southern tip of Africa and slave traders in the United States of America. So you are correct to suggest that even though the bulk of the Black American community has roots in West Africa, in the area stretching from Senegal, Gambia, down to Angola, and of course, including in that sweet Congo, it's also fair to suggest that East Africa should not be neglected in trying to understand the ravages of the slave trade.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I'm really enjoying this conversation. You got my mind, processing a lot of the stuff you're saying. I wanted to ask you about another book. I mean, you wrote so many books. I gotta dig in. I gotta check these works out on the very interesting topics. Now you have a book, The End of Empires, African Americans in India.
That is correct. That book mostly deals with the intertwined struggles between people of African descent in North America and the people of South Asia, in today's India, of course, including today's Pakistan, including today's Bangladesh. There's even a few tidbits in that book about Burma, Myanmar, and the latter struggle against British colonialism and how that linked with our struggle against U.S. empire, slavery, Jim Crow, etc. The book, of course, concludes generally with Indian independence and Pakistani independence in August 1947.
Okay. Wow, that seems very interesting as well. Like I had kind of mentioned earlier about the slave trade on the east, and I can ask your opinion on this. I hear people speak about the diaspora. Like I say, in particular, they'll say North America, South America, maybe some parts of Europe. But are Indians a part of the diaspora as well, and the Aborigines in Australia, and the Negritos in the Philippines?
It depends on how you want to define it.
I
I
would
mean,
say just by their skin color, they are so dark. They have beautiful black skin. I look at them as black people. I think Marcus Garvey, he had Indians in the UNIA, and Malcolm referred to them as black. And like you say, the similarities in the colonization and the oppression and the slavery. What are your thoughts on that dark skinned Indian people?
well, let me begin by saying that I did a book some years ago on the South Seas, which necessitated a visit to Fiji in the South Pacific. It's a neighbor, as you know, of Australia and New Zealand. And the indigenous of Fiji, their language has similarities to certain East African languages, which is a linguistic indication that in time immemorial, there was a connection between Fiji and East Africa. With regard to India, of course, before the rise of the African slave trade in the 1500s, there was considerable intercourse between East Africa and India. And of course, after the rise of the African slave trade, you had a slave trade from East Africa heading eastward, not only into India, but as far east as Iran, for example. In fact, the black slavery in Iran didn't end until the 1920s, for example. So there are many linkages between and amongst this community, but how you define the African diaspora, it varies from individual to individual, from scholar to scholar.
Yeah, definitely. That's something I definitely have noticed. Because everybody have their opinion, but to my understanding, there were Africans that voluntarily went to India, and some were taken involuntarily. So they did have like a slave trade. But I wanted to ask you, let me see more about. Now you have another book, Black and Brown: African Americans and the Mexican Revolution.
That is correct. It principally deals with the period from 1910 to 1920, although there is a foray into the decades leading up to 1910 and the years following 1920. You may know that during that period of tumult in our southern neighbor, speaking of the United States, southern neighbor, Mexico, you had Black American soldiers who were dispatched by Washington to intervene in the internal affairs of Mexico, some of whom were captured. On the other hand, you had individuals like Jack Johnson, the heavyweight boxing champion of African descent, born in Galveston in 1978, who ran afoul of the U.S. law and sought exile in Mexico during the Revolutionary decade and tried to establish a citadel, an anti-Jim Crow citadel, an anti-racist citadel south of the border. And we also know, and I dealt with this in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, on the ties between the former Mexican province of Tejas, or Texas, which seceded from Mexico in 1836 because Mexico, under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, had moved in 1829 to abolish enslavement of Africans. The so-called Anglo-American settlers weren't having it, led by Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, who then named the leading cities in this province after themselves. I'm speaking to you right now from Houston, Texas, for example. And I recommend that book to your attention as well.
Okay. Now I can ask you this: with so many different books and different topics, have you ever considered, or have you created a documentary or tried to get it made into like a film?
Well, I've appeared in a number of documentaries. I mean, writing books is enough for me. I mean, I'll leave it to others to pursue documentary films. And I've worked with, actually, I'll be filmed on Friday on a documentary film on the death penalty in Texas. But that's a full-time job, and raising money, getting cameras, etc. So I think I'll stick to writing books. There are others who can do films.
Yeah, you're definitely right about that. But I'm almost for certain, man, these would be some great documentaries because it's a lot of topics that I haven't heard too many people cover, if at all. And the way that you breaking it down, like I say, they always say the book is better, so you got to check out the book. But I'm definitely sure they'll make some great documentaries. Let me see. Okay, now I wanted to ask you about. You wrote a book called Mau Mau in Harlem: The U.S. and the Liberation of Kenya.
So Kenya in East Africa was colonized by the British in the late 19th century. And needless to say, the Africans were not necessarily supportive of being colonized. And this culminated in what was called the so-called Mau Mau Rebellion, which reached a fever pitch in the 1950s under the leadership of Jomo Kenyatta, whose son Uhuru Kenyatta just stepped down as president of independent Kenya a few years ago, succeeded by William Ruto. And the book you reference deals with the connections between Kenya and the United States, particularly Black Americans and Kenya. You may know that the 44th US president, Barack Obama, was born of a Kenyan father and a Euro-American mother. He, speaking of Barack Obama Sr., comes to the United States to study at the University of Hawaii. And that was part of this process whereby the United States was trying to influence Kenya by educating its youth, which then leads to the birth of Mr. Obama. So that in a nutshell is what that book concerns.
Okay. So we're about 26 minutes in. So I want to ask you about maybe one more book, Confronting the Black Jacobins. Did I say that right?
Jacobins, it's all good.
Right, right. Now, what is that about?
So the subtitle, the U.S., the Haitian Revolution, the Origins of the Dominican Republic. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, was a world transformative event. We've spoken in previous minutes about the African slave trade, which encompassed, as you know, and as we've said, a good deal of the continent, including Madagascar, including East Africa, including West Africa. Well, to a certain extent, that odious commerce came to a screeching halt with the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which contributed to a general crisis of the entire slave system, including the slave trade, which can only be resolved with this collapse. Haiti establishes the first independent Black republic and attracted the negative attention of many of the European powers. Attracting the negative attention of the United States is the principal subject which that book concerns.
Okay, okay. That's really interesting as well. I got a chance to actually study abroad in the Dominican Republic. I learned a little bit about the culture, the language, and definitely a little bit about Haiti. It's been a few years, but I remember going to a museum one time, and I'm not sure if it was a list of presidents or what it was, but I know that the first one was like was it Toussaint Louverture? They had him listed, and that was just interesting to me. The guy was explaining to us, I guess along the lines of how they were able to successfully overthrow the French and get control of the island, man. Okay, okay. Let me
And
see. Oh, go ahead, go ahead.
no, I just want to, no, it's your program. You take the lead.
Okay, okay. Okay, yeah. So we're about 28 minutes in. Now I can ask you this. Are you currently working on anything? And for the viewers who do want to check out, the amazing books that you have written, is it do you have a website where they can get everything, or is it a better place for them to follow and keep up with what you're doing?
Well, my lectures are all over YouTube. My lectures are on the Activist News Network. My books are readily available. Just do a search and you can find them. What I'm working on now, I'm about to finish a book on slavery in Washington, D.C. I have a book coming out next year called African Americans and a New History of the United States of America. A book I published this summer is Armed Struggle. That's with a question mark. Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. I'm going to write next year a book entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in Asia and the Pacific. After that, I'll write a book dealing with Egypt and Ethiopia and the United States, stretching from the 19th century to the 20th century. After that, I'll be working on a book on slavery in Mississippi, which brings us full circle because, as noted, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, but my parents came from Mississippi and their grandparents were enslaved Africans in Mississippi.
Oh wow! I look forward to all of that, especially the one you say with Ethiopia and Egypt. Now, just one thing before we go, you said that you had a book about the Black Panthers that came out this year.
That's correct. It's easy to find.
Okay. I don't know if you got just a quick second to just tell us what it's about before we go, or.
Sure. The Black Panthers, as I tell the story, organized in Northern California in circa 1966. One of their first branches was in Southern California, and principally in Los Angeles. They had an internationalist bent. I deal quite a bit with their diplomatic legation in Algeria and their solidarity delegations to the then Soviet Union, to North Korea, to what was then North Vietnam. I deal with their relationship with what is now the Republic of the Congo, not to be confused with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'm referring to what is now referred to as Congo Brazzaville. I deal with how the US government repressed them violently, including assassinations, including unjust imprisonment, including chasing them into exile.
Wow. Okay. Okay. I might have to check that one out first. That sounds amazing. So yeah, I just want to thank you again so much. Man, definitely appreciate you taking the time to come by.